Before we begin, take a quiet moment. Where are you listening from right now? What city? What country? What corner of the world? And what time is it where you are? Late night, early morning, or somewhere in between? Wherever you are, settle in and let the world grow slow. Tonight, we step back into the Middle Ages. Picture a cold, moonlit night in the late Middle Ages. A small village lies in silence under a blanket of mist. In the village square, a lone torch flickers against the timber-framed houses, casting dancing shadows on the cobblestones. Not far away stands a wooden post with iron shackles, the pillory, empty at this late hour, but a reminder of the day's judgment. In the distance, a church bell tolls softly, announcing the approach of midnight. Villagers shutter their windows, huddling by hearth fires, mindful of the laws and customs that govern their lives even in darkness. In this world, justice is as present as the chill in the air, a constant, quiet force that shapes every person's fate. It is a world where guilt or innocence might be proven not by evidence as we know it today, but by trials of fire and water, by oaths on holy relics, or by the capricious mercy of a feudal lord. In such a time, one might truly feel guilty until proven lucky, surviving the perils of trial and punishment by equal parts faith, courage, and fortune. Yet, within this timeless stillness, there is also order. Each village and town, each lord's manor and city court, operates within a framework of rules passed down over generations. By day, these same silent streets would bustle with life, merchants selling wares, peasants carrying produce, perhaps a town crier announcing the Lord's edicts, and if you listened closely in the market, you might hear snippets of conversation about a recent trial or an upcoming court day. Medieval justice was not just gallows and dungeons. It was woven into the fabric of daily existence. From how people bought and sold land, to how they married, worked, and resolved quarrels with their neighbours. Over the next few hours, we will wander through this medieval world of justice, slowly and calmly, as though walking through a living museum by lamplight. We will visit different regions of Europe, England, France, the German Holy Roman Empire, the Iberian kingdoms, Scandinavia, each with its own laws and customs. We will witness how ordinary people experienced law in their daily lives, how they sought fairness, how they feared punishment, how they navigated a system that could be at once sophisticated and superstitious. Our journey will be immersive and unhurried, as if exploring a sprawling old library of tales and records by candleglow. Allow the slowness of the narrative to wash over you. Time feels different here, measured by seasonal rhythms and church bells, not by any rush or modern haste. Let each scene unfold gently. A village meeting at dusk, a lord's hall at dawn, a crowded city square at noon. Through these scenes, medieval justice reveals itself not in one single story, but as a collage of countless lives and customs. As we drift deeper into this world, the goal is not to judge it by modern standards, but to understand how people then found meaning and security, or sometimes terror, in their laws. The tone will remain calm and descriptive, like an old storyteller speaking softly by the fire, so that you can relax and even drift to sleep if you wish, enveloped by the atmosphere of a long ago time. So imagine now that you are an unseen observer in this medieval night. A faint chorus of crickets fills the air. The wind carries the distant sound of a watchman's clapper as he makes his rounds atop the town walls, calling out that all is well. In the shadows, The symbols of justice stand silently. A set of scales carved above the courthouse door, the stocks awaiting the next miscreant. The church doors offering sanctuary to any soul desperate enough to knock. Justice in the Middle Ages is about to unfold before us, slowly, step by step. Keep your cloak wrapped tight and your lantern in hand. We begin our journey into medieval justice, a journey where being proven innocent often meant being proven lucky. In the medieval world, law was everywhere, quietly guiding the patterns of everyday life. Far from being a distant concept, the law was something even common villagers knew in their bones. By the later Middle Ages, around the 13th and 14th centuries, even humble peasants in England, France, and beyond were surprisingly familiar with courts and legal customs. Contrary to popular belief, medieval law was not all arbitrary tyranny or chaotic violence. Over centuries, a complex lattice of courts and procedures had developed, creating what one historian calls a larger legal world of sophisticated law courts, formal procedures, and written records in which ordinary people actively participated. Think of a peasant family in an English village around the year 1300. They are villeins, unfree tenants, bound to the local lord's manor, yet they have rights and expectations under the customary law of that manor. Perhaps the aging father remembers how he once took a dispute over a cow to the manor court and won. The court, held every few weeks by the lord's steward, followed a routine. Villagers gathered in the manor's great barn or under a large oak. Evidence was heard, maybe just simple testimonies and oaths, and a jury of local villagers. Yes, even in a medieval manor, one could find jurors chosen from neighbours, rendered a verdict. The rolls of that court, if someone could read them aloud, would show careful records of cases and judgments, all in Latin or the local tongue, kept on parchment. Even at this local level, there was an emphasis on due process. Formal complaint, summons, witness oaths, and a respect for written record-keeping. The manorial court handled everything from land inheritance to petty theft. And while it ultimately served the lord's interests, bringing him income in fines, it also provided villagers a forum for justice and conflict resolution. Across Europe, one would find analogous scenes. In a French village in Normandy, for instance, the seigneurial court might convene before the lord's appointed judge, called a bailli or seneschal, where peasants plead their cases in the local customary law unique to that region. In a free imperial city in Germany, the town council might sit in judgment at the Rathaus town hall, enforcing the city's charter and statutes. And in an Italian commune like Florence or Venice, magistrates guided by Roman law traditions would adjudicate disputes among merchants and artisans. Everywhere, life was bounded by laws. Who could marry whom? Who inherited what portion of land? What tolls must be paid at the bridge? How much a baker could charge for bread? These rules were often publicly proclaimed by town criers or posted notices, and they were reinforced by the collective memory of the community. For most people, the first encounter with law came early in life, and in simple forms. A village child learned from parents that stealing eggs could get you put in the stocks for a day. A young apprentice in a city learned the guild regulations he must obey on pain of fines. A farmer knew he owed a certain amount of grain to the lord as a due, enforced by law. The community itself played a role in law enforcement. If a crime occurred, neighbours might raise the hue and cry, literally shouting and chasing a thief until he was caught. Every citizen was expected to join the chase, or else face a fine for failing in their duty. In small villages, there were no professional police, so the community was the police, bound by law to help bring wrongdoers to justice. In towns, there might be a night watch, a handful of guards or citizens patrolling with lanterns and staves to keep order after dark, calling out the hours and reporting any fires or disturbances. One can imagine their footsteps echoing on cobbled streets as they peer down alleys for suspicious figures. What was the public perception of law in this era? Likely a mix of respect, fear, and at times resignation. The law could be a shield, as when a poor tenant sued a richer neighbour and won, or when the announcement of the king's peace protected a fair from armed knights. But the law could also be a sword, sharp and unforgiving, especially to those of lower status, who had little say in its making. People knew that punishments could be harsh. A simple theft might mean a lashing, or time in the pillory, being locked by the neck and wrists in a wooden frame in the marketplace, subject to public scorn. A more serious crime, like repeated burglary, could cost one a hand or an ear, severed as punishment and warning to others. And the ultimate penalties, for grave crimes like murder, arson, or treason, were often death, whether by hanging, beheading, or in some places, worse fates. These spectres of punishment loomed large in the medieval imagination. Travelling into a town, one often saw gibbets by the road, where the rotting remains of executed criminals hung as a grim deterrent, a practice common enough that chroniclers mention birds picking at those corpses on the wayside. Such sights must have instilled a deep caution in people's hearts. They remind our modern minds that medieval folk lived with violence more visible, more normal than we do, and this surely affected how they viewed the law. Law was the thin line between order and chaos, between God's peace and the war of all against all. Even a superstitious trial or a draconian sentence was preferable, in their eyes, to anarchy and blood feud. Indeed, one curious aspect of medieval justice is how deeply it was tied to the community's sense of cosmic order. When something terrible happened, say, a child was killed by a wild animal, or a rash of fires broke out, people sometimes turned to the law not only to punish blameworthy parties, but to symbolically restore balance. In the most striking examples, even animals and insects were put on trial. This might sound absurd, but numerous records survive of animals being formally accused and tried, particularly in France. For example, in 1,457 inches, the French countryside, a sow and her 6 piglets were arrested and tried for the murder of a 5-year-old boy. The local court, complete with prosecutors and even a lawyer, appointed perhaps symbolically for the pigs, heard witness testimonies. The sow, identified as the main culprit, was sentenced to death by hanging, while the piglets were acquitted for lack of evidence of their participation. As bizarre as this event seems, it was not unique. More than 100 such animal trials took place from the 13th through 18th centuries. Pigs were the most frequent defendants, often for attacking children, but there were also cases of locusts, rats, bulls, and even roosters put on trial. To medieval villagers, these trials served a psychological need. When something frightening and inexplicable occurred, putting the offending animal through the familiar ritual of a trial could give the community an illusion of order in a frightening world. By executing the pig as if it were a murderer, they symbolically avenged the child and cleansed the moral stain on the village. This close intertwining of law, community, and belief is key to understanding medieval justice. Religion and law were deeply connected. The Church taught that God's law was above all, and secular laws were legitimate only insofar as they aligned with divine justice. Thus, people often saw legal ordeals or oaths as invoking God's judgment directly. A trial wasn't merely a human affair. It was a stage on which God might intervene to reveal the truth or punish the wicked. In daily life, this meant great reverence, and sometimes fear, for oaths. If a person swore innocence on the Bible or a saint's relic, lying under such an oath could doom their soul. The community's trust in a person could hinge on their willingness to make an oath and on their reputation for honesty. Likewise, perjury, lying under oath, was considered not just a crime, but a sin that could bring down divine wrath. In small communities, where everyone knew everyone, a reputation for truthfulness was precious. Without it, one might not find anyone willing to stand as an oath helper for you, more on that soon, or to vouch for your character in court. During daylight hours in medieval towns and villages, justice was often a public, communal spectacle. We might envision a typical scene. Under the bright sun in the town square, a magistrate or bailiff reads out the charges against a defendant before a gathered crowd. The defendant, perhaps a local baker accused of selling underweight bread, stands with head bowed. Evidence might be simple. The underweight loaf itself produced. Witnesses, customers, complaining of being cheated. Maybe even the test of the town's standard weights. The baker could plead for mercy, and if it's a first offence, he might be let off with a stern warning and a fine. But if he's a repeat offender, the punishment may be a day in the pillory, where townsfolk will see him locked up and perhaps throw vegetable scraps at him as they pass. Public shame was a potent penalty in a tight-knit world. To be mocked by your neighbours while immobilized and helpless could be a greater deterrent than a secret fine. As the sun sets and night returns, the instruments of justice, the stocks, the gibbet, the courthouse, stand silent again, silhouetted against the twilight. Families retreat to their homes, saying prayers that they will never run afoul of the law. For in this era, unlike our own, there was no guarantee of innocent until proven guilty. In practice, an accusation often put the burden on the accused to prove their innocence, whether by compurgation, oath swearing with supporters, or by submitting to an ordeal. One did not have a lawyer, in the modern sense, arguing one's case, except perhaps in higher courts or wealthy litigants in later centuries. Instead, God, luck, and community opinion were the advocates you relied on. It's little wonder people trod carefully, observing the myriad laws and customs of their community. For a misstep could spiral into a dire situation. Having painted this broad backdrop of medieval justice's role in daily life, we will now journey region by region, exploring how these general patterns took on unique flavours in different corners of medieval Europe. Each region, England, France, the Holy Roman Empire, Germanic lands, the Iberian Peninsula, and Scandinavia, had its own legal evolution, its own courts and customs, and its own way of blending folk tradition with emerging principles of law. These differences are fascinating, showing that medieval justice was not a monolith, but a patchwork quilt of many colours. Before we delve into specifics, take a moment to imagine the vastness of medieval Europe by night. From the icy fjords of Norway to the dusty plazas of Castile, from London's winding lanes to Rome's ancient halls, countless little scenes of law and justice played out under the same stars. A thief sneaks through an alley in Paris, only to be caught by the night watch. A merchant in Bruges counts coins to pay a fine for a trading violation. A village priest in Poland listens to a woman's confession of wrongdoing, assigning a secret penance. A bandit hiding in the Black Forest of Germany, declared outlaw, cooks a meagre supper over a fire, knowing he's beyond the law's protection. All these moments, disparate yet connected by the thread of justice, form the tapestry of the medieval legal experience. Our pace will remain unhurried. We will linger in each region, as one might linger in different rooms of an ancient castle, examining the unique artifacts in each. There is no rush. The goal is to let the stories and descriptions wash over you, offering both insight and a sense of calm continuity. If your eyes grow heavy as we explore these old tales, know that you can drift off and return later. The narrative is here to soothe as much as to inform. With that gentle reminder, let us travel first to medieval England, where kings and commoners together forged a distinctive system known as the common law. On a misty autumn morning in medieval England, a crowd gathers outside a lord's manor house for the weekly manor court. The air is crisp and smells of damp earth and wood smoke. Villagers shuffle in, tugging their wool cloaks tighter, and exchange hushed whispers about today's cases. Perhaps a dispute over a boundary hedge will be heard, or a accusation that someone's pig rooted up a neighbour's garden. At the front, seated on a raised dais in a wooden chair, is the Lord's steward. He will act as judge on the Lord's behalf. On a tripod nearby burns a brazier of coals to keep him warm, and the smoke curls slowly into the pale morning light. A clerk unrolls a lengthy strip of parchment, last court's roll, to read out the pending business. Despite the mud on their boots and the simple life they lead, these peasants are participating in a formal legal ritual that has its echoes in the highest courts of the realm. In medieval England, justice operated on multiple levels, and one of its foundations was indeed this humble scene, the manorial court. Every manor, essentially the lord's estate and the community on it, had its own court, where the lord, or his steward, presided, and where local customary law ruled. As we saw, these courts could be surprisingly formal. By the 13th century, many manor courts even started using juries of local villagers to decide certain facts, imitating the royal court's procedures. The thousands of manor court rolls surviving from medieval England show us a busy legal life among common folk. Land transactions, inheritance disputes, minor criminal offences like a fray brawling or petty theft, and breaches of the assize regulations. For example, a brewer selling bad ale would be presented and fined. They reveal that peasants knew how to sue and be sued. They knew how to make an essoin, an excuse for missing court, like being ill, or how to pledge sureties, getting friends to guarantee one's appearance or payment. Far from being isolated from law, the entirety of medieval English society, and not only its elite elements, was remarkably law-minded and familiar with courts. Law was something even commoners could use for their own benefit, not merely a weapon used against them. But of course, above the manor courts were the king's courts, and it was in England that these royal courts developed a distinctive system known as the common law. Around the year 1170, during the reign of King Henry II, a transformation began. Henry II, a vigorous and reformist king, sent out travelling justices, judges in ire, they were called, to hold royal courts throughout the land. This created a unified network of justice that answered to the crown. Instead of everything being local and varied, certain cases, especially serious crimes and disputes over land, could now be heard according to the king's law, which soon was called the common law, because it was common to all England. By the early 13th century, central courts like the Court of King's Bench and Court of Common Pleas sat permanently at Westminster, near London, drawing litigants from all over the realm. The image we have just seen, an illumination from around 1460, shows the Court of King's Bench in session, with the accused standing in chains before the justices. It's a glimpse into how formal and high stakes these royal courts could be. To the medieval English mind, royal justice was both a powerful tool and occasionally a distant thunder. Powerful because the king's courts were seen as offering superior remedies. For example, they could compel a lord to respect a free tenant's rights, something a local villain might not get in his lord's own court. Distant because travelling to Westminster or following the royal circuit required money, time, and knowledge. It was typically the gentry and middling folk, wealthier peasants, burgesses, minor nobles, who leveraged these higher courts. Still, even for a villager, the influence of the common law trickled down. The manor courts themselves started to mimic the procedures of the king's courts. They began keeping written records in the 13th century, perhaps to compete with royal courts and retain users. They also adopted juries and other common law features. It has been noted that manor courts and common law courts belonged to the same legal universe, not separate worlds. A serf in the manor might not sue in the king's court villeins, being unfree, generally couldn't bring cases in royal courts against their lord, but the spirit of legal process pervaded even his context. Let's slow down and imagine a specific case in an English setting, to feel how it might unfold. Say it's the year 1308 in a Midlands village. Two neighbours are quarrelling. Alice accuses her neighbour John of assault. She says John struck her and drew blood during an argument over grazing rights on the village common. John denies it. On the next manor court day, Alice brings her plea before the steward. The steward calls for oath helpers. Alice swears on the Bible that she is telling the truth about the assault. She has to find a group of people, perhaps 6 or 12, often relatives or close neighbours, who will also swear that they believe Alice's oath is true. This practice is known as compurgation, or wager of law, a common method in early English law. If Alice can produce the required number of compurgators, and they all solemnly swear for her, then, by law, her version is accepted. John is deemed guilty of the assault and might have to pay a fine to the lord for breaching the peace and damages to Alice. However, if Alice fails to get enough people to back her oath, perhaps John's good reputation means folks are reluctant to swear against him. Or if any of her compurgators falter in their oath, she loses her case. It's not about directly proving the assault with evidence as we think of it. It's about the moral weight of sworn oaths and community belief in one's honesty. In essence, Alice must demonstrate her credibility through the voices of her peers. This was a way to resolve she said, he said conflicts in a society with no forensic science. Let the community's sense of who is truthful decide the outcome. Compurgation was essentially a medieval form of character witness trial, and it persisted in English law for centuries, in a limited form, even into the 19th century in civil matters. Now, consider a more serious accusation, something that might not be solvable by simple oaths, theft or murder. In Anglo-Saxon England, before the Norman conquest of 1066 and the early Norman period, such grave charges could be decided by trial by ordeal. The idea was to place the judgment, literally, in God's hands. Since only God knew the truth of a secret crime with no eyewitnesses. By the High Middle Ages, ordeal practices in England included the ordeal of hot iron and the ordeal of water. If a man was accused of murder and there was no clear proof, the court might order an ordeal. Under priestly supervision, the accused would have to carry a red-hot piece of iron a certain number of paces, or plunge his hand into a cauldron of boiling water to retrieve a stone. His hand would then be bandaged. After 3 days, the bandages would be removed. If the wound was healing cleanly, he was innocent. If it was festering or unhealed, it was a sign of guilt. In the water ordeal, also called the ordeal of cold water, the accused was tied and lowered into a deep pool or pit of cold water, usually blessed by a priest. If he sank, the water, as God's pure element, was accepting him, meaning he was innocent. They'd haul him up quickly to avoid drowning. If he floated, the water was rejecting him as impure, meaning guilty. It sounds almost whimsical or cruelly arbitrary. But to medieval people it was a solemn religious event, complete with prayers and invocations of divine judgment. That said, chroniclers note that many accused miraculously passed the ordeal, perhaps because local priests or communities sometimes found discreet ways to prevent a deadly outcome. After all, no one really wanted their neighbour to die from a scalded arm, if they could help it. A pivotal moment came in the year 1215, when the Church, at the Fourth Lateran Council, banned clergy from participating in ordeals. Since priests were essential to the rituals, blessing the water or hot iron, interpreting the results, this effectively ended trial by ordeal across Christendom. England complied with remarkable speed. Almost immediately after 1215, English courts stopped using ordeal. Instead, they turned to a novel mechanism that had been slowly developing, the jury trial. By the 1,220 seconds and 1,230 seconds, if someone in England was accused of a serious crime, a felony like murder, robbery, rape, etc., they would be judged by a jury of 12 local knights or free men who would hear evidence and render a verdict. Initially, these jurors were more like witnesses themselves, men of the region who likely knew the facts or had inquired about them. But gradually, they became triers of fact, listening to testimony. The ancestors of today's trial jury. This shift was one of England's unique contributions to legal history. While the continent moved towards inquisitorial procedure, where officials gathered evidence and even used torture to elicit confessions, England stuck with the idea of a group of peers deciding guilt, a system that would evolve into the common law jury system. Let's picture a late 14th century scene. An English shire court or an assize judge is hearing a case of highway robbery. The accused, a peasant named Will, stands before the justices, guarded by 2 sheriff's men. A jury of local freeholders has been assembled. One by one, witnesses speak. A merchant testifies that he was waylaid on the road and identifies Will, perhaps uncertainly, as one of the masked men who robbed him. A neighbour testifies that Will suddenly had a lot of money the day after the robbery and was seen carousing at the alehouse. Will, for his part, protests that he was home sick that day. He even brings his wife to swear that he never left the hut. The jurors retire to discuss. Perhaps they already have some knowledge of Will's reputation. Maybe he's long been suspected of thievery. Or they weigh the merchant's certainty and the circumstantial evidence. If they find him guilty, the law is harsh. Robbery is a hanging offence. There is no elaborate prison system to house felons long term. Execution, or less commonly, mutilation, is how society permanently removes serious criminals. So Will might be taken to the gallows and hanged within days, as a crowd gathers to watch solemnly. If the jurors acquit him, he goes free. No torture, no ordeal, just the voices of his community deciding his fate. We can sense how luck and reputation could sway such outcomes. In a time before forensic proof, a lot depended on how convincing one appeared and what the community believed. The common saying, innocent until proven guilty, was not a legal guarantee at this time. It was more often that one was suspect until proven innocent by oath, ordeal, or verdict. There was, however, a peculiar escape hatch in English justice for those who feared the worst. Sanctuary. If a person accused of a crime could reach the doors of a church and claim sanctuary, they were temporarily safe from capture. In England, sanctuary was even codified. The fugitive could stay in the church for up to 40 days without being removed. During that time, he had to decide whether to surrender and stand trial, or confess to the crime and agree to leave the realm, abjure the realm. If he chose to abjure, a ceremony would take place. Before witnesses, he would confess his deed, swear to depart the kingdom forever, and usually be assigned a specific port and route to leave. Then, wearing a badge of a cross, to show he was under church protection, he would be allowed to travel unharmed to the port and take ship into exile. The understanding was that he must never return without royal permission. Effectively, permanent banishment. This might seem a lenient outcome, but exile in the Middle Ages was a harsh fate. To be cast out of one's homeland, without ties or property, often equated to a slow death or a life of misery abroad. Still, for many it was preferable to the noose, and for the authorities it was a way to rid themselves of a criminal without bloodshed. Sanctuary, in a way, made the accused prove lucky enough to reach holy ground and leverage the mercy of the church. As one historian noted, a short period of sanctuary, followed by lifelong exile, was still better than a death sentence. And for many people, it was also better than prison, since medieval English jails were dreadful, often just cells where one might languish on bread and water and easily die of disease. English law also had another mercy: benefit of clergy. Initially, this meant that if you were an ordained clergyman, you could not be tried by secular courts for a capital crime. You'd be handed to church courts, which never executed. The worst they do is imprison or defrock you. But in late medieval England, this privilege extended in a quirky way to anyone who could read. By tradition, a person could claim clergy and demonstrate it by reading a passage from the Bible, often Psalm 51. Since most laymen were illiterate, this was a rough way to identify clergy. Over time, it essentially became a loophole for first-time offenders of certain crimes. If you could recite the neck verse, as it was nicknamed, because it saved your neck, you'd be punished by the church court, usually a branding or penance, rather than hanged. Many a literate rogue saved himself this way, and even illiterates eventually memorized the verse to claim the benefit. This odd legal fiction persisted and was a storied part of English justice. One could indeed escape the gallows by the lucky chance of literacy or clever memory. Such nuances again show how medieval justice could bend to mercy through loopholes, even as it remained draconian in general. By the late Middle Ages, England's legal system had grown more structured. The king's judges travelled on regular circuits, the assizes, to every county, usually twice a year. to handle serious criminal and civil cases. Local justices of the peace, typically knights or esquires appointed in each county, met quarterly to try lesser crimes and keep order. This system meant that by 1400 or so, an English villager might witness a grand spectacle, the arrival of the king's justices with a retinue, holding court in the shire hall or a local abbey chapter house. These justices, learned in law, would have juries indict suspected criminals through a grand jury, and then petty juries to decide guilt. It was the birth of a more recognizable court system. Still, at its heart, it relied on local community participation, local jurors, local constables, local reputation. The common people were embedded in the process, as jurors and as those raising accusations. England was somewhat unique in Europe for moving away from trial by ordeal and avoiding official torture in ordinary criminal trials, at least until much later, for special cases like treason. After ordeal was gone, English courts did not adopt torture to extract confessions, as many continental courts did. This is not to say English justice was gentle. The threat of execution often coerced people to plead guilty in hope of some clemency. And there were other harsh tactics, like putting pressure on accused who refused to plead, famously the peine forte et dure, where one could be pressed with weights, an extreme and rare measure. But compared to, say, France or Italy, where interrogation under torture became a formalized part of inquisitorial procedure for serious crimes, England stood apart. In the 1400s, an Englishman accused of heresy or witchcraft, for example, was less likely to be officially tortured than his European counterparts, though extralegal brutality could still happen. We can end our English sojourn with a peaceful scene that belies the legal intensity underneath. Imagine walking through a quiet English village at dusk, say in 1450. The day's work is done. Smoke rises gently from cottage chimneys. Near the village cross, or perhaps a large oak, is a notice board. Pinned to it is a parchment, the proclamation of the latest royal statute, sent from London, or perhaps the sheriff's notice of an upcoming court session. Few villagers can read it, but they know its gist from hearing it read aloud by the priest after Sunday Mass. It might warn that all men over 15 must practice archery on Sundays, or face a fine, a real law at one point, or announce that a new toll will be collected for bridge repairs, or outlaw some band of robbers in the region. The villagers discuss it in low tones. They recall the last time the sheriff's men came through, chasing a felon who broke sanctuary. They remember the hanging that took place a year ago on the nearby hill, and how the church bells tolled for the soul of the executed. They also remember that old Robert, the reeve, successfully sued the Lord's bailiff for taking too much hay tax, a small victory that still makes them nod in approval. To them, the law is both fearful and familiar. It is the drumbeat that underlies their communal life, sometimes quick and harsh, other times slow and steady. As the stars prick through the sky above, and an owl hoots from the church tower, the English villagers rest under the uneasy but reliable canopy of King's law and God's law intertwined. In summary, though we speak quietly and without hurry, medieval England's justice was defined by the interplay of local customary courts and a strong central royal system. It prized community-based verdicts, juries, oath helpers, and developed unique legal protections, sanctuary, benefit of clergy, that might let the lucky or clever escape death. It was a system where one standing in the community and one's ability to navigate arcane procedures could mean the difference between life and death. The phrase guilty until proven lucky could well describe the plight of many an accused person in England, who needed either the grace of God through ordeal or jury, or the grace of the king through pardon or benefit of clergy, to emerge unscathed. Our journey now takes us across the English Channel to the Kingdom of France, where the tapestry of justice was woven from different threads: custom and written law, feudal rights, and royal power, creating a pattern at once similar and strikingly different to England's. Travel with me now to medieval France, in the calm of a starry night over the fields of Normandy and the vineyards of Burgundy, where the voices of village elders and royal judges alike speak in the language of loi and coutume, law and custom. Under the dim glow of a waning moon, a small French town in the 14th century settles into slumber. The stone houses of the Bourg cluster around a central square. At one end of the square stands a covered market hall, and just beside it, the prison tower, a stout building with narrow windows. Inside one of its dank cells, a solitary prisoner, perhaps a thief awaiting judgment, lies on straw, iron chains on his ankles. A single candle sputters as a guard dozes at his post. All is quiet, save for the distant rushing of a river and the occasional bark of a dog. Above the rooftops rises the silhouette of a castle keep, seat of the local seigneur's power. And not far off, the spire of a church points to the heavens, a reminder that God's law watches over all. This peaceful scene belies a dynamic tension that defines medieval French justice: the coexistence of diverse local customs with the growing authority of the crown. In France, law was a mosaic, or, as some say, a patchwork quilt, different pieces in different regions, slowly being stitched together by royal hands. During the Middle Ages, France was not a unified legal realm like England. Instead, it was famously divided into the pays de coutume, customary law regions, mostly in the north, and the pays de droit écrit, written law regions, largely in the south. North of the Loire River, law was based on age-old Frankish and feudal customs, usually unwritten and specific to each province or even each lordship. South of the Loire, by contrast, Roman law, the legacy of the old empire, reintroduced via scholars from places like Bologna and Montpellier, held sway as the written law. Roughly, a village in Normandy might follow one set of customary rules, while a town in Provence had statutes influenced by Justinian's code. Moreover, even within these broad zones, dozens of local coutumes existed. One 13th century jurist commented that, as the realm fragmented under feudal lords in the 10th, 11th, 13th centuries, Frankish law broke up into many different systems, according to the territories, some extremely small, won by princes and prelates. This paints a picture of myriad mini-kingdoms, each with its own laws. How did ordinary people experience this? Let's imagine two villagers in different parts of France. Pierre in Picardy, northern France, and Jacques in Languedoc, southern France. Pierre's world is governed by customary law, perhaps the coutume of Beauvaisis, or a similar compilation. This law isn't written down formally in his daily life. It lives in the memory of the elders and the pronouncements of the Lord's provost at court. Pierre knows, for example, that under their custom, if a man dies without sons, his property can pass to his daughters, or perhaps it can't. Some customs allowed female inheritance, others didn't. He knows that if he's caught poaching the lord's deer, the customary fine is heavy, or he could even lose a hand, depending on local rules. Local tradition might even allow something unusual, like jugement de Dieu, an old ordeal, unless forbidden, or trial by combat in certain disputes. Now Jacques in Languedoc lives where Roman law influence is strong. Perhaps he's heard educated men talk about the Code and Digest of Justinian. The local judge might quote Latin maxims. Jacques' town statutes might say that written evidence, a signed charter, carries great weight in court. A very Roman idea, whereas up in Picardy, Pierre's neighbours rely more on sworn oaths and witness testimony. In short, a French person's legal outlook depended much on geography. One common experience across France, however, was the presence of the seigneurial court. Much like the English manor court, French lords, seigneurs, held jurisdiction over their tenants and vassals. In a small village, the lord's baillie or seneschal would preside periodically, hearing cases of land, tenure, local debts, minor crimes, and so forth. Punishments for peasants, as elsewhere, could be fines, flogging, the stocks, or worse, for serious offences. The lord had the right of haute justice, high justice, in many places, meaning he could execute criminals on his land. Though often for capital cases, the sentence might be carried out in larger towns with proper facilities, like gallows and executioners. The public spectacle of punishment was as familiar in France as anywhere. Picture a market day in a provincial French town. Amid the bustle of trade, there might stand a pillory, with a wretched soul locked in it for public shame, maybe with a sign listing his offence, boulange affameur, baker who gave short weight, or voleur, thief. Nearby could be a whipping post, where, at a set hour, the town sergeants will lash a convicted troublemaker. These scenes were sadly common, and served to educate the populace on the consequences of breaking the law. However, by the high Middle Ages, above the local Lord's Justice, there increasingly shone a higher authority, the King's Justice. As the Capetian and later Valois kings of France consolidated power, 12th, 15th centuries, they worked to make the crown the ultimate source of justice in the land. A key institution here was the Parliament of Paris, which by the 14th century had become the kingdom's supreme court of appeal. If a litigant felt wronged by a seigneurial court's decision, or if a case was particularly important, it could end up before the Parliament in Paris, a body of royal judges, mostly trained lawyers, who would review and pronounce judgment. The Parliament of Paris not only judged cases, but also had a role in registering royal edicts, and thus helped shape national law. It's interesting to note that by the late Middle Ages, the language of law in France was changing. More and more, cases were being recorded in French, not just Latin, especially the coutumiers, custom law compilations, in the north. King Louis IX, Saint Louis, in the 13th century, had urged that justice be done fairly, and even established the famous enquêtes, royal inquiries into local officials' conduct, showing the king's desire to curb abuse. People began to see the king as fountain of justice. An old painting might show St. Louis under an oak of Vincennes, personally hearing the petitions of the poor, an idealized image of the just king. In practice, a common person in France might rarely go to the royal courts, but they would know of them. They'd hear that the king's bailiffs could overrule a wicked lord. They'd hear that, in certain cases, like a noble feuding violently, or brigands overrunning an area, The king's men came with armed force to impose the king's peace. Over time, some customs got written down in coutumières. For example, the Coutumes de Beauvais, authored by Philippe de Beaumanoir in 1283, gave a detailed picture of North French customary law. These works often had the tone of trying to rationalize and harmonize local practices. There was a sense that custom itself was being refined and reinvented by clerks and jurists. Learned jurists in the 13th–15th centuries, many trained partly in Roman law, started to impose a bit of order on the chaos of customs, sometimes by writing them down and comparing them. In doing so, they occasionally criticized practices they deemed illogical, like the trial of animals. Some custom books flatly stated that animals cannot be culpable under Roman legal principles. Yet local courts continued such trials because custom was powerful and symbolic. Speaking of animal trials, France is particularly known for them, as mentioned. Let's revisit that to glean more atmosphere. One case stands out as both chilling and oddly bureaucratic. Falaise, Normandy, 1386. A sow was accused of killing a small child. The sow was tried in a secular court, found guilty, and executed by hanging. But not before being dressed in a human suit of clothes for the hanging, as some sources note, to add formality to the proceedings. Decades later, the Savigny case of 1457 we described had even more detail, with piglets acquitted and a sow hanged. These trials were conducted with almost comical seriousness, complete with attorneys and witnesses. While it's tempting to chuckle, for the villagers it must have been half carnival, half catharsis. A strange theatre where their deeply held beliefs about order and evil played out. Medieval illustrations and later engravings depict such scenes. Robed judges on benches, a pig in the dock, spectators craning to see. The executioner, after doing his duty to a pig, might receive a new pair of gloves, as he would after a human execution, symbolizing the removal of sin or stain. The very absurdity of it highlights a key point about French justice in medieval minds. Justice was not merely about people. It was about the moral equilibrium of the world. If something or someone, human or beast, broke the peace, they had to be dealt with so that harmony could return. In an age without scientific understanding of, say, animal behavior or mental illness, a homicidal pig or a madman were seen almost as agents of chaos or the devil. Putting them on trial was a way to affirm that no one is outside the moral order. Let us imagine a more typical case in a French setting. Say, a feudal dispute over land in the 1200s. Jean, a lesser noble, claims a certain wood belongs to him by right, but his neighbour, the abbey down the road, also claims it. First, local arbitration might be attempted, maybe by the count of the province or another lord. Failing that, the case could go to the Parliament of Paris, if significant enough, since church versus noble disputes were tricky. In Parliament, learned magistrates might actually consult written law, previous judgments, even Roman law, principles like consulting the digest for a property rule. Unlike the relatively rough and ready local courts, the Parliament was influenced by the nascent legal science. By late medieval times, French royal justice had embraced procedures akin to the Roman canon law. Written pleadings, learned advocates, systematic torture of accused criminals in certain cases to secure confessions, especially in serious crimes where evidence was lacking. Yes, unfortunately, by the 14th century, in many parts of France, If one were accused of a grave crime, you might be subjected to la question, the euphemism for judicial torture, in hopes that you confess and thus make the judge's task easier. This was part of the inquisitorial process adopted broadly in Europe, with detailed rules, such as requiring a judge's order and presence of court officers. It was believed to be a last resort to get the truth, used only when other evidence, called indices, strongly pointed to guilt, but not conclusively. The methods might involve strappado, hoisting by ropes, water being poured down one's throat, or the boot crushing wedges, etc., all carefully prescribed so as not to kill the person, since a dead suspect was of no use. The Church itself, though it banned ordeal, by the late 13th century condoned controlled use of torture for heresy trials, the Papal Inquisition, a sad irony. In France, secular courts also use torture in high crimes, albeit within regulated confines. A record from a city court might note, "The accused, put to the question, confessed." This contrast with England is sharp. While English law relied on jury verdict, French and continental law relied on obtaining a confession as the ideal proof. The saying was, "La confession est la reine des preuves." Confession is the queen of proofs. A French villager would perhaps be aware of this difference if he heard tales from across the Channel. But within his world, it was normal that a suspected poisoner or murderer, if denying guilt, might be subjected to severe interrogation in the castle dungeons or town jail. However, torture was typically for serious felonies. For the more everyday interactions with justice, the French people dealt with prévôts, provosts, baillis, and other officers who collected fines and adjudicated small matters. A common farmer's main legal concerns would be paying the banalities phase for using the lord's mill, oven, doing his required labour and rents, and staying out of trouble. If he committed a wrong, often a fine could settle it. Much revenue for lords, and the king came from fines and fees. In fact, ordinances from the crown frequently urged officers not to abuse their power by extorting fines unjustly, though abuse happened. A glimpse of public perception in France. On one hand, there was a respect for royal justice as more impartial. When, for instance, the Jacquerie, a violent peasant revolt, was brutally suppressed in 1358, the survivors later petitioned the king for pardons or adjustments, indicating they saw the king as the ultimate arbiter above feudal hatreds. On the other hand, heavy-handed justice by nobles or royal officers could spark anger, as seen in many local rebellions when taxes or punishments were seen as too harsh. Generally, the peasants and townsfolk valued order. After all, France, in the 14th–15th centuries, suffered from the 100 Years' War. Roving mercenaries, bandits, unstable times. In such context, any justice, even stern, was preferable to lawlessness. One fascinating case is the town of Dijon, which in the 15th century began employing a permanent executioner and actively pursued bandits to show that the Duke's justice was restoring order after war. People would have approved seeing robbers broken on the wheel if it meant safer roads. Amid all this, one should note regional differences. The South, with more Roman law influence, had different inheritance rules. For example, daughters could inherit equally in some places, whereas the North had the preciput for the eldest, etc. Different marital property regimes, community property, in much of South versus dowry based in North. The diversity was so great that a saying attributed to a later era was likely true even in medieval times. Autant de coutumes que de paroisses. as many customs as parishes. It's like a crazy quilt of law. Only later, in the 16th century, did France undertake a formal codification of coutumes. But medieval jurists did begin harmonizing, for example, by writing summaries of common principles gleaned from various custom laws. By 1500, the coutume of Paris was so well regarded that it became a kind of default law in areas lacking clear customs. Let's slow down further and conjure a small-scale event, a village mediation in France, perhaps around 1,400 inches Burgundy. A fight broke out between two families. One accused the other of cheating in a sale of an ox, and blood was spilled. Rather than escalate to a formal court, the village priest and a few elders gather both parties at the church porch. With calming words, they urge reconciliation under the law of charity. They remind the families that the Duke's ordinance forbids carrying feuds, and that if they don't resolve it, the seigneur's sergeants will drag someone to the castle dungeon. Eventually, under community pressure, the offending family agrees to pay a composition, some money or goods, to the injured family, and they embrace before the priest, swearing to keep the peace. Such informal justice coexisted with formal structures. Often, medieval folk preferred to settle matters without going to court, to avoid fees and further ill will. The law encouraged settlements. Even royal judges liked when parties reconciled. It meant less work and more stability. This emphasizes that while we speak of justice systems, a lot of practical medieval justice happened through negotiation, custom, and local authority quietly intervening. As night deepens in our imaginary French town, think of a tavern where travellers swap stories. A merchant from Lyon tells of how fair and orderly the trade courts, Hugues consuls, are becoming in his city. Merchants judging merchants, adopting written commercial rules. A pilgrim from Flanders recounts a disturbing sight of a witch trial he heard of in Lorraine. A woman burned after being accused of sorcery to cause a hailstorm. A clerk from Paris boasts of having seen the Grand Chamber of the Parliament, with robed presidents and advocates quoting law in elegant French and Latin. All these tales reflect a France that by 1400 is large, varied, and culturally rich in its legal life. We should mention the role of the Church in French justice too. The ecclesiastical courts in France, as elsewhere, handled many matters: marriage disputes, legitimacy, wills, if involving charitable bequests, and moral offences, like adultery or blasphemy. A French peasant might more readily find himself before a church official for, say, not observing a holy day, or for a complaint of beating his wife. Those days domestic violence sometimes fell under church admonishment, than before a king's judge. These church courts, run by the diocesan officials, usually gave spiritual punishments: fasting, pilgrimage, public penance. They were generally seen as lenient, too lenient, some secular lords complained. But they also engaged in the infamous heresy trials, especially in the south of France, where Cathar heresy had been strong in the 13th century, and later where witchcraft fears emerged. The Inquisition, a church-run, but often state-cooperating institution, operated in parts of France. Notably, the Inquisitors in the 14th century tried the Templars with royal instigation, and in the 15th century, the Inquisitor of Arras conducted a notorious witch hunt. These trials could involve torture and execution by burning, under the notion of saving souls by extirpating heresy. To the average person, this was a terrifying but distant affair, unless it touched their town. Overall, for the French commoner, the king's justice gradually became a hope and a reality by the end of the Middle Ages. People began petitioning the king's officers for redress and acknowledging that the era of private feudal war and arbitrary lordly power was giving way to royal law and order. When Louis XI or Charles VIII travelled, people would present petitions for grievances to them. The language of royal ordinances increasingly stressed justice and the common good. It's not that medieval France was idyllic under law, far from it, especially during war times when law broke down. But by 1500, the framework of a more unified legal system was visible. As we conclude our French chapter, picture dawn breaking over a French town like Rouen or Dijon around the year 1500. Market stalls are being set up. On the Grande Place, a notice is being nailed up. An official summary of the Ordinance of Villas Cotterettes, 1539, is read aloud by a town herald, OK? 1539 is a bit beyond our medieval scope, but let's cheat a little to make a point. It declares that records shall be kept in French, not Latin, and that priests must keep registers of baptisms. An early vital records law. Townsfolk murmur at the notion. The crown's reach is entering even the recording of births and deaths. The world is changing. Medieval France is transitioning into early modern France. Yet much remains familiar. The notion that law comes from the king, but is tempered by local custom and the will of God. For now, though, the butcher, the baker, and the carpenter are more concerned with their day's work than high law. But they take comfort, perhaps unconsciously, that their society, though stratified and sometimes cruel, has rules and recourse, however imperfect. There are courts where one can bring a complaint, authorities to appeal to beyond one's immediate lord, and an underlying belief that justice, human or divine, ultimately matters. We leave France with a sense of a rich tapestry. On it we see embroidered a village scene of folks at a coutume court, a royal judge on circuit dispensing the king's law, a bizarre pig trial reminding all of cosmic order, and a huddle of villagers reconciling under the priest's guidance. The threads of custom and written law cross and recross. It's time now to journey eastward into the diverse lands of the Holy Roman Empire, where myriad princes, free cities, knights, and churchmen created a legal landscape as vast and varied as the empire itself. Our narrative, like a traveller along the Rhine or the Danube, will meander and observe how justice was pursued in Germanic Europe, in the shadow of emperors and amidst forests and towns. Continue with me into the next watch of the night, as stars wheel slowly overhead and a gentle river mist accompanies our passage into the German lands. A traveller in the forests of Germany in the 13th century might have feared many things: bandits, wolves, the dark, but perhaps most of all, the Fehde, or private feud. In the Holy Roman Empire, the German-centric empire that also encompassed parts of Italy, Burgundy, and beyond, law and order were notoriously fragmented. Picture a patchwork quilt spread over Central Europe. Each patch a different lordship, duchy, city-state, or bishopric, each with its own laws and courts. By midnight, in a small German market town, say around 1400, the streets are quiet and the town gates shut. On the gatehouse wall hangs a newly posted notice: the Emperor's latest proclamation of the Landfrieden, the imperial peace, forbidding feuds and private warfare within the realm. The town burghers support it. They are weary of robber knights and nobles who take the law into their own hands. The empire's rulers, have issued many such peace edicts over the centuries, striving to impose the rule of law over an unruly feudal society. Some have effect for a time, some are ignored. But they mark an ideal, that above the many local lords there is an emperor and a concept of imperial justice meant to bind them all. In practice, however, medieval justice in the empire was as decentralized as anywhere in Europe. Early on, Germanic tribal law had favored composition fins over corporal punishment, a carryover from the idea of Wehrgeld, where crimes, especially killings, were avenged or resolved by payments to the victim's family. Public punishments were rare, except for grave offences against the community. But as the Frankish kings, like Charlemagne, and later the Ottonian and Hohenstaufen emperors, built their authority, more crimes came to be seen as offences against the king's peace. By the High Middle Ages, German towns had courts and sometimes elaborate laws, often influenced by Magdeburg law or Lübeck law in the north, east for cities, spreading a somewhat uniform municipal law. Rural areas still had Hofgerichte, manorial courts, run by noble landowners or their stewards. And in some regions, notably places like Westphalia, a very peculiar institution arose. The Wemgericht, or Vermick Court. These were semi-secret tribunals, mostly of free judges, under the Duke of Westphalia's aegis, that dealt with serious crimes and feuds, sometimes in clandestine proceedings. Vermick courts gained a legend of holding midnight trials under lime trees, with coded summons and secret hangings of outlaws, a mix of myth and reality, but they did function as an extra layer of justice in a lawless time, at least in that region. The fact that such courts arose indicates the need people felt for justice beyond the local lord, especially when local lords might themselves be the perpetrators of violence. The legal development of the empire is marked by some key texts. One is the Saxon Spiegel, Saxon Mirror, a 13th century law book compiled by Eike von Repgau. This text recorded Saxon customary law in the vernacular German and became a widely used reference for judges in northern Germany. It covers feudal duties, land law, and even process, offering a mirror of what was considered just at the time. It's said that the Sachsenspiegel allowed for things like trial by combat in certain disputes, and spelled out in detail various fines and penalties. For example, if someone failed to perform their legal duties, they might suffer a corporal punishment. The Sachsenspiegel notes cases like a Schultheiss, village head, who didn't fulfill duties, could be whipped along with a fine. The use of corporal punishment and torture increased in later medieval German law as central authority tried to assert control. Another key milestone was the Carolina, formerly the Constitutio Criminalis Carolina of 1532 under Emperor Charles V. While just outside the medieval period, it was largely based on existing late medieval practices and effectively systematized them. It explicitly replaced trial by ordeal, long out of use by then, with a system of evidence and confession, with torture allowed under defined conditions to obtain that confession. The Carolina is famous for its clear, if grim, instructions on torture and proof, and also for listing witchcraft as a severe crime punishable by burning. This codification marked the end of the medieval era by bringing an imperial standard to criminal law, though local laws still varied greatly. But stepping back into our medieval frame, how did ordinary folk in the empire experience law day to day? Regional diversity is the theme. In the south, say Bavaria or Swabia, local ducal laws might apply. In the north, Brunswick, Saxony, different customs. By the 14th century, many local lords issued their own Landrechte territorial law codes or Stadtrechte town laws. For example, the Duke of Bavaria might proclaim a law on coins or on how to deal with vagabonds. The city of Nuremberg had an extensive law code for its citizens. Amidst this complexity, a few general trends can be noted. Feudal courts. Noble courts where vassals could be tried by their peers. For instance, if a knight wronged another, they might settle it in a Landgericht, or even through judicial duel as a right of nobility. Trial by combat was a recognized avenue in German lands, especially for knightly honor disputes. It persisted into the late medieval period. If two knights had a serious accusation like treason or cowardice, they could be granted a trial by combat in presence of a prince. There's imagery in Fechtbücher, fight books, of such duels, even including rare cases like a duel between a man and a woman, with particular handicaps to the man, to even the field, as per some municipal codes. City courts and guilds. In the many free imperial cities, Frankfurt, Augsburg, Cologne, etc., patrician elites and later guilds ran the city councils, which also acted as courts for citizens. A burgher of a rich city like Cologne would likely be judged by city law, which could be quite progressive. For instance, many cities had detailed regulations on commerce, sanitation, and public order enforced by city guards and Richtmann judges. Public punishments were common in cities too. The pillory for bakers who sold bad bread, banishment for repeat petty thieves, execution for murderers, often by sword in the empire, for noble or honourable deaths, by hanging for commoners, by drowning for women in some areas. Yes, some southern German cities used drowning for female infanticide perpetrators, etc., in an oddly gendered approach of so as not to defile the air with a woman's body, a rationale given in some texts. Village assemblies. In more rural communities, especially in alpine regions, or places like Switzerland, which was part of the empire until it effectively broke away, villages enjoyed a lot of autonomy. They often had ding or thing gatherings, just like Scandinavian thing, since it's a shared Germanic idea, where village representatives managed local issues. In Swiss cantons, local direct democracy was strong. Villagers might collectively decide on local ordinances. So a Swiss farmer's idea of justice might be very participatory compared to, say, a Prussian serf's in eastern regions. Over time, peasants lost freedom and were tightly lord-controlled. Outlawry. The empire had a concept of Reichsacht, imperial ban. If someone committed a grave offence and didn't submit to court, the emperor or imperial authority could place them under the ban, essentially outlawing them, meaning anyone could harm them without penalty. And they lost all legal rights. Famous outlaws include people like the robber baron Eppelin von Gehlingen, who was outlawed and captured. Legend says he escaped the gallows by leaping away on his horse. Outlawry in medieval Germany was serious. It was a death sentence, in a way, since you were legally dead. But enforcement was tricky unless someone took the initiative to hunt the outlaw. Sometimes, local communities took it upon themselves to eliminate outlaws. Other times, outlaws roamed free in lawless areas, hiding in forests or remote castles, doing much damage. The Holy Roman Emperor, theoretically the supreme judge of the empire, had courts, like the Hofgericht imperial court, in earlier times, and after 1495, the Reichskammergericht, imperial chamber court. But in the true Middle Ages, say before 1500, imperial justice was often exercised by the emperor travelling around, an itinerant court, or by appointing royal judges for special cases. Notably, Emperor Frederick II in the 13th century issued the Constitution of Roncaglia, and others that tried to systematize law, in Italy mostly. In Germany, emperors from Rudolf I to Sigismund often had to mediate disputes among princes rather than impose common laws. However, in the late 15th century, Emperor Maximilian and the Imperial Diet instituted reforms. The Reichskammergericht was meant to be an impartial high court, to which even a peasant could appeal theoretically. They also outlawed private feuding in 1495, officially the Ewige Landfriede, eternal peace. But these changes are right at the cusp of medieval, modern. Let's take a human perspective. Imagine a German peasant in 15th century Swabia. He is neither free nor fully unfree. He owes labour to his local count, but he can also farm his own plot. If wronged by a neighbour, he will probably go to the manorial court, the Dorfgericht, presided by the lord's appointed Schultheiss, and some Schoffen lay jurors who help judge, often experienced villagers. These courts often used Carolingian-era strengen, strict rules, supplemented by local custom. Perhaps, if a property boundary is contested, they might physically walk it, and neighbours swear to the known boundary, reminiscent of how English perambulations worked. Some practices were universal. If there's a fight or small theft, likely a fine, and maybe a charivari, public shaming ritual is imposed. If a serious crime occurs, the lord might send the accused to a city for trial, or bring a higher nobilities court into play. Many rural folk dreaded being handed to a princely Blutgericht, blood court. Those were reserved for capital crimes, and were severe. For example, the Margrave's court might sentence a convicted murderer to be broken on the wheel, a common execution method in Germany for heinous crimes. The criminal is tied to a wheel and bludgeoned, then left to die. This ghastly punishment, which we mention only in passing and softly, was part of the landscape of fear that kept many in line. Public executions in the empire could be elaborate, with different methods for different crimes, reflecting a sort of grim symbolism. Thieves hanged, arsonists burned, murderers broken, coin forgers boiled or burned, etc. Each territory had its favoured customs. These were typically carried out by an executioner, Scharfrichter, who often had a quasi-outcast status. Executioners and their families were socially shunned, ironically, for doing the dirty work of justice. However, they also had medical knowledge in some cases, like being skilled in treating wounds. Executioners often doubled as licars, healing the very injuries they might cause in interrogations. This duality is peculiar. The executioner was both feared and needed. There's a story of the Nuremberg executioner, who was famed for his herbal remedies. High society ladies would secretly visit him for cures. Yet publicly, he had to live on the fringes. This underscores how medieval justice carried social stigmas, not just for convicts, but even for those administering it. Certain professions, like the knacker, the gravedigger, and the executioner, were considered dishonourable, unrein, unclean. This tied into a broader concept of Ehrbarkeit, honourability, which was central in German towns. To be a full citizen, one needed an honourable trade, no criminal record, etc. Law and honour were linked. A dishonourable person's testimony might even be inadmissible in court. Thus, punishment extended beyond the scaffold into lifelong reputational effects. A branded thief, some regions would brand a convicted thief on the cheek or shoulder, bore a mark that ruined his social standing forever. An intriguing feature of some Germanic law was the concept of Gottesurteil, judgment of God, essentially ordeals and duels, as mentioned. While ordeals were banned in 1215, trial by combat lingered much longer. For example, the famous case of the combat between Otto of Brunswick and Henry of Schwerin in the 13th century. Two noblemen settled a dispute by single combat, which was watched by the emperor himself. Or in some towns, if a man accused another of heinous crime and no proof could be found, they might be allowed to fight it out. There's even a 1409 record of a duel between a man and a dog in France, the dog avenging its master's murder by fighting the murderer. A bizarre tangent, albeit in France, not Germany, but it shows how ordeal-like beliefs persisted. In the empire's legal texts like the Luzerner Schilling, a chronicle, or the Fechtbuch of Talhofer, we see depicted the sanctioned judicial duels with set rules and weapons. By late medieval times, though, the practice was fading under influence of Roman law, which disapproved of such methods. We should highlight one more element: class differences in law. In the empire, as elsewhere, nobles, burghers, peasants, and serfs had different legal statuses. A nobleman often had the privilege to be judged only by peers, privilegium de non appellando, and such meant he could avoid ordinary courts. If a noble committed a crime against a commoner, often it was hard to prosecute him unless a higher noble or the emperor intervened. Conversely, if a peasant struck a noble, the retaliation could be extremely severe, even death, because it was seen as an affront to the social order. Towns had charters that granted citizens, usually property-owning males of the town, certain protections and avenues for justice that a peasant outside the walls didn't have. In essence, law was stratified. There were multiple legal systems operating in parallel for different estates of society. This was a feature of continental Europe in general, whereas England had one common law for all, at least in theory. Places like the Empire had knightly courts, ecclesiastical courts, burgher courts, manorial courts, each for different folks. Let's imagine a calm scenario in a German city like Regensburg, circa 1470. The night watch patrols the streets, calling out the hour. Hört ihr hören und lasst euch sagen, unsere Glock hat 10 geschlagen. Hear ye, sirs, and be advised, our bell has struck 10. The city gates are locked. If someone is out after curfew without a light or permit, they might be detained. In the morning, such a minor offender might be brought before the Stadtrichter city judge, and either fined a small amount or put in the stocks for a few hours for breaking curfew. The system of civic ordinances was strong in these self-governing cities. They regulated things like not dumping waste in the street, though enforcement was variable. Fire safety rules, like every house must keep a barrel of water ready, and even morality. Brothels were often confined to certain alleys. Taverns had closing times to reduce drunken brawls. The medieval German city was arguably ahead in some police functions. Some had a permanent Stadtwache, city guard. Nuremberg, for instance, had an organized watch and even detective-like officials to investigate thefts. As for prisons in the Empire, there were some. Particularly, debtors' prisons became common in late medieval cities, where those who couldn't pay debts were confined. This was more civil than criminal. Criminals usually weren't kept long-term. They awaited trial, or execution, or banishment. but some could be sentenced to years in a tower cell for moderate offences, especially those noble or clerical convicts who by privilege avoided execution. They might get life in a fortress instead. A notorious example, in castle dungeons like the Ehrenberg Castle or others, knights who fell afoul of a prince might spend decades locked away. For the ordinary folk, punishment was more immediate and corporal. The approach was short and sharp, rather than long incarceration, due to the expense of keeping prisoners, and the prevailing philosophy that justice should be visible and final. Torture deserves a brief revisiting in the empire context. A 14th century city law might say, if there is strong suspicion, like multiple witnesses, or being caught with bloody clothes after a murder, but no confession, the accused can be tortured, but only once, and not to the point of death. The Carolina later codified such conditions. There were even grades of torture, first showing the instruments, which often scared people into confessing outright, then perhaps tying arms behind and hanging by a rope, the strappado. Maybe some thumbscrews. Torture was supposed to be stopped as soon as the person was willing to confess, and importantly, the Carolina insisted that a confession under torture had to be repeated freely afterward to count. Many judges tried to extract confessions without physical coercion. Some were skilled interrogators verbally, but torture did happen, especially in witch trials that in German lands spiked horrifically in the 15th and far more in the 16th, in 17th, though that's beyond our current focus. Even as early as 1400s, local trials in what is now Switzerland and Germany sent alleged witches to stakes, often after forced confessions implicating others. To keep our tone gentle, we won't detail these, but we acknowledge that they form a dark part of late medieval justice, born of superstition, fear, and a legal system that allowed torture and put strong weight on confessions extracted thereby. However, to not dwell on darkness, consider also the strands of justice reform in the empire. In 1498, Maximilian, I proclaimed that henceforth all legal proceedings should be in German rather than Latin, to be more accessible, similar to France's Villus Cotterets a few decades later, and England's use of English later on. He and his successors also promoted the idea of professional judges, trained in law, rather than purely noble arbitrators. The influence of Roman law scholarship was huge. German universities, like Heidelberg, Cologne, etc., taught law that integrated Justinian's principles, and many princes hired these juristen to staff their chanceries and courts. Thus, by 1500, though custom still reigned in villages, in higher courts one might hear references to Codex Justinianus, or the Digest, and see more written verdicts. There was a fusion of Roman and German law, culminating in the Carolina and territorial codes of the 16th century. Now, an atmospheric closing for the empire. A traveller stands on a hill at night overlooking the Rhine Valley, circa 1450. In the distance, he sees the torches of a party of armed men, perhaps the Count's soldiers, escorting a prisoner to a castle. Maybe it's a highwayman they caught. They'll likely hang him on the morrow, adding one more skeleton to the gibbet by the crossroads. Yet in a nearby city, the guildsmen are drafting a petition to their lord to institute a permanent peace court to keep the roads safe. And far away in Vienna, the Emperor's Council is debating an imperial law to curb these endless feuds and brigandage. The wheels of change turn slowly, but they do turn, The traveller sighs, wraps his coat around him, and moves on, hoping the next inn is within the safe walls of a town under the king's peace. The Holy Roman Empire's justice, in sum, was characterized by local autonomy, class privilege, and gradual centralization of legal norms. It was perhaps the most internally diverse legal landscape in medieval Europe. A saying often misattributed to the empire is that it was neither holy nor Roman, nor an empire. But when it comes to law, it did maintain a sense of being one civilization, drawing on a shared Roman and Christian heritage, albeit applied in countless local ways. The medieval German word Recht encapsulates both law and justice as a concept of what is right. People in the empire, for all the variation, believed in a moral order upheld by law, whether through the village chauffeur or the emperor's ban. And like elsewhere, they had to rely on a bit of luck and divine favour to navigate it safely, lest they find themselves on the wrong end of the law's sword or wheel. We have traversed now the forests and towns of Central Europe in our nocturnal exploration. Let us gently turn our attention southwest to the Iberian Peninsula, where medieval justice took shape amid a complex tapestry of cultures. Christian and Muslim realms, Reconquista wars, and the eventual unification under Christian monarchs. The night breeze carries the scent of orange blossoms and a distant echo of church bells, and perhaps the call to prayer from centuries past. Onward to medieval Iberia, where law and survival had their own unique dance. It is a warm evening in the late 12th century in Toledo, a city where church spires and mosque minarets share the starlit skyline. In the narrow streets of the Juderia Jewish quarter, families are settling in for the night, oil lamps flickering behind wooden shutters. Across town, in a courtyard of the Alcazar castle, a learned judge appointed by the Christian king sits under an arcade, sifting through parchments. These parchments are copies of the old Visigothic law code, the Liber Judiciorum, known here as the Fuero Juzgo, which, though centuries old, still influences local law in Castile. Not far away, in a different quarter, a group of Muslim merchants discuss a contract. They will likely resolve any dispute among themselves by Islamic Sharia principles under the eyes of their own Qadi, since Toledo, freshly taken by Christian forces not long ago, still allows its large Moorish population a degree of legal autonomy. Meanwhile, in the countryside outside the city, a newly established Christian fuero charter grants a village of settlers rights to elect their own alcalde, magistrate, and to be free of certain taxes for years as an incentive to populate the frontier. Here, in Iberia, medieval justice is a story of convergence and contrast between different legal traditions. Christian kings enforcing Latin-based codes, Islamic law flourishing in remaining Moorish territories and even tolerated under Christian rule, and local fueros customizing rights for diverse cities and towns. Medieval Spain, and by extension Portugal, was shaped by the long conflict and coexistence of Christian and Muslim realms. 711,492. As Christian kingdoms, Castile, Aragon, Navarre, Portugal, etc., gradually reconquered the peninsula from Al-Andalus, Muslim, Spain. They encountered sophisticated Islamic legal systems and large populations of Muslims and Jews under their governance. This led to the phenomenon of parallel legal systems. For example, a Christian king might allow morerias, Muslim communities, to use Sharia courts for personal matters, and aljamas, Jewish communities, to use rabbinical courts for theirs, while overall governance remained with the king's law for public and interreligious issues. This pluralism was unique in Europe. A traveller in 1300s Castile could see in one day a Catholic ecclesiastical court handling a marriage annulment, a Sharia court settling a mercantile dispute among Muslims, and a royal audiencia, secular court, judging a quarrel between a Christian and a Jew. And each might use different language and law: Latin, Spanish for the royal, Arabic for the Muslim, Hebrew or a local mix for the Jewish. And perhaps all parties would know a bit of each other's tongue. Let's illustrate with an example. Valencia, circa 1375. It's under the crown of Aragon, recently conquered from Moorish rule. King Jaume had granted Valencia its own furs fueros, a set of privileges and laws for the city. Under these furs, Christians have full rights as citizens. Muslims and Jews are considered protected, but second-rank subjects. They pay special taxes and cannot hold authority over Christians. If two Muslims have a dispute, they may go to their Qadi in the Moreria quarter. If a Muslim and a Christian have a dispute, they go to a royal court, but the court might use translators and even consider Moorish law in deciding if appropriate. For instance, property held by a Muslim might be inherited per Islamic rules if it only concerns Muslim family, even under Christian sovereignty, especially early after conquest when such accommodations were made. But as time passes, the trend is toward unifying law under Christian norms. By the 14th, 15th centuries, many of these accommodations shrink, especially as religious tolerance wanes, leading to expulsion of Jews in 1492 and Muslims in 1502 over 1609 eventually. But in the medieval period proper, one still sees a mosaic of legal practice. One of the greatest medieval legal monuments from Spain is the Siete Partidas, compiled under King Alfonso X, the Wise of Castile, in the 1262. The Partidas is a comprehensive law code in 7 parts, covering everything from canon law, government, justice, family law, commerce, to criminal law. It drew from many sources: Roman law, canon law, Visigothic law, local custom, and even some Islamic influences. Although it wasn't immediately implemented everywhere, it met noble resistance who preferred their local fueros. Over time, the Siete Partidas gained authority and became the foundational law for much of Spain and its later colonies. Its language is Castilian, making it an early example of a vernacular legal code in Europe. What would it mean for ordinary folk? Suppose a Castilian merchant in 14th century cites a rule on contracts. It might well come from the Partidas, which itself borrowed from Roman law principles like good faith in contracts. Or a noblewoman could argue her dowry rights per the Partidas. The Partidas even had enlightened sections for its time, like protections for the disabled, guidance on fair treatment of slaves, etc., though within the world view of that era. Yet, local fueros, charters, were equally important. Especially during the Reconquista, Christian kings granted numerous fuero municipal to towns and regions to encourage settlement and loyalty. For example, the Fuero de Sepúlveda Castile, 1076, or the Fuero of Cuenca, around 1180, are famous. These charters often provided settlers freedom from certain taxes, the right to self-govern by a council, and specific legal customs. One interesting custom in some fueros was the concept of the huebra, a day when all citizens had to help a neighbor plow his fields in turn, a sort of community labor law. Fueros could also have unique punishments. For example, one fuero said, if a man draws blood from another in a brawl, he must pay X amount, or, if unable, stand in the plaza and receive a set number of lashes. The idea was to attract people with promises of rights, but also clearly outline duties and justice. Survival tactics for people in these frontier zones might involve strategically choosing whose jurisdiction to live under. For instance, a peasant might prefer to move to a town with a generous fuero that limited the lord's exactions and guaranteed a fair hearing in court by elected alcaldes magistrates. Indeed, the Reconquista era saw population transfers, Christians moving into formerly Muslim areas, Muslims sometimes relocating to lands still under Islamic rule to avoid harsh new regimes, etc. Legal guarantees played a part in these decisions. In the remaining Muslim-ruled parts of Spain, like the Kingdom of Granada, until 1492, justice was administered per Islamic law, Maliki school, with qadis, and sometimes the caliph, sultan's courts for higher appeals. A day in Granada might see a qadi arbitrating inheritance, according to the Quranic rules, with daughters getting fixed fractions, etc. Or punishing infractions with Sharia-prescribed penalties, though, in practice, medieval Muslim rulers often tempered strict Sharia punishments with discretionary justice or fines. After Granada fell, initially the Treaty of Granada, 1492, allowed Muslims there to continue their laws for a time, but this was rescinded within a decade, as Castile sought uniformity and conversion of Muslims to Christianity. Portugal, similarly, had its Afoncine ordinances, 15th century, consolidating laws. Earlier, the Portuguese kings, like Afonso II and others, had gathered Livros de Leis e Posturas. By 1446, King Afonso V promulgated the Ordenações Afoncinas, which collected existing laws in Portuguese. Late medieval Portugal also started switching to written law, like the Ordenações Manuelinas around 1514, just outside our time frame, but prepared in late 1400s. This mirrored Spain's trend of compilation and Roman influence. Punishments in Iberia were comparable to elsewhere. Execution, mostly by hanging or decapitation for nobility. Mutilation, cutting off a hand for thievery, appears in some early fueros, but not universally applied. Flogging, fines, and public shaming. The Spanish Inquisition, established in 1478 again, just after medieval period, but its roots are medieval in dealing with heresy, became infamous for harsh interrogation and burning of heretics, like conversos, Jews who converted but were suspected of backsliding. Before that, in medieval times, there were smaller, earlier inquisitions, like the papal-sponsored one in the 14th century, against the heresy of the Free Spirit or other sects, but nothing on the scale of the later Spanish Inquisition. However, even earlier, religious unity was a legal pursuit. For example, Alfonso X's partidas included laws that discriminated against Jews and Muslims, requiring them to wear distinguishing marks and prohibiting them from certain roles, reflecting growing intolerance. Enforcement varied, but it shows the legal direction toward a Christian uniform society. Let's consider survival tactics for people under Iberian justice. If you were a Muslim, Mudeya, a Muslim under Christian rule, around 1400 inches Aragon, One tactic was to rely on the Al-Yama community leadership to intercede with the king's officials on your behalf. Often, these communities paid collective bribes or gifts to ensure good favor and more autonomy. A Jewish community might do similarly, negotiating charters of protection from the king, for instance. The Jews of Barcelona had letters from the Count King promising to safeguard them and allow their Beth Din rabbinical court limited jurisdiction. If you were a peasant, you might move to a Consiglio town council territory, where common lands and grazing rights were well protected by local ordinances to avoid a feudal lord who could press you into harsh service. Many Castilian peasants, in fact, lived in quasi-independent villages called behitrias, where they could choose their lord, or had none, subject directly to the crown, giving them more leverage. The crown's law, like Partidas, tried to curtail such autonomy over time, but it persisted. Also, joining a military order, like Santiago, Calatrava, or the Church, could put one outside normal jurisdiction. A monk or friar accused of crime would be tried in ecclesiastical court, generally milder than secular, though if it was serious crime, they degrade him, then hand over to secular for punishment. Still, ecclesiastical courts for minor offences could mean a penance rather than a whipping, so a young man with a troublemaking streak might find taking the cloth a legally safer station. Prisons in medieval Iberia existed largely in cities, for holding before trial, or for debtors. Long-term imprisonment as punishment was not the norm, similar to elsewhere. There's a note from a 13th century Castilian source that prison is for those who await their judgment. Once judged, a man should not linger, implying he should either be executed, fined, or otherwise punished, but not just warehoused. The harsh environment, disease, poor food, meant jail was effectively a death sentence if kept too long. That's why sanctuary and abjuring, as practiced in England, weren't codified strongly in Spain. Instead, one might flee to another kingdom or into Muslim territory to escape justice. But internal sanctuary in churches did exist by church law. However, Spanish kings sometimes respected it less, particularly as the Reconquista fervor made them less tolerant of accused traitors or spies hiding in churches. One colourful aspect: frontier justice. On the marches between Christian and Muslim zones, law could be rough. Raids and counter-raids were common. A captured enemy might be summarily executed or sold as slave. Knights of either side sometimes duelled or engaged in heroic single combats, as romanticized later. There was also customary truces. For instance, the truce of God concept extended in Spain to arrangements like allowing traders safe passage even during conflict. But when regular war was on, legal niceties often gave way to might. The Partidas talk about just war and how prisoners can be enslaved if captured in a just war. So, a survival tactic in a war zone might be to claim you were a neutral foreigner or hold up in a church. Even Muslims sometimes dashed into a Christian church to claim sanctuary. Occasionally it worked if the captors were pious enough. To honour it, there are records of warring kings exchanging such refugees. Regional differences in Iberia also meant law varied. Catalonia had the usages customs of Barcelona, one of the earliest codified sets, with a strong Roman law influence. Leon had the Fuero de Leon, early 11th, a set of laws King Alfonso V gave, considered one of first written Christian law codes after Visigothic. These often emphasized protections for the church and for certain types of property. etc. The late medieval Spanish kingdoms also developed central courts. Castile had the Royal Audiencia by the 15th C, a high court with professional judges called oidores. Aragon had the Justicia of Aragon, a unique official who stood as a guardian of laws and could adjudicate disputes even between nobles and the king, a check on royal power. There's a famous story in 15th C that king wanted to arrest a noble without trial, and the Justicia refused to allow it. This is a big part of Aragonese identity. Their law was very protective of nobility and liberties, which ironically hindered quick justice sometimes, but did ensure some due process. Now, an atmospheric closing scene for Iberia. It's 1,490 inches. A Castilian town like Avila. Night has fallen. The great city walls are dark against the sky. In the plaza, a new edict from Los Reyes Católicos, Ferdinand and Isabella, hangs. It proclaims that all must conform to the one true faith, or depart, hinting at the expulsion of Jews that will come in 2 years. It also speaks of the Hermandades, the Holy Brotherhoods, a kind of rural police force the monarchs empowered, made of armed citizen patrols, who now roam the roads to catch thieves and murderers and ensure the Queen's peace. This is a late development. Ferdinand and Isabella created the Santa Hermandad as a police military force, the first of its kind nationally, to curb lawlessness. And indeed, 2 Hermandad horsemen clatter through the gate at dusk, bringing in a shackled man caught robbing travellers. They deliver him to the corregidor, the royal governor, who will see him in the morning. The townsfolk gossip. Under the old lax feudal ways, that robber might have gotten off by bribing a local lord. But now, under the monarchs and Hermandad, he'll likely swing from the gallows by week's end. There's a feeling that a new era of stricter, more centralized justice is arriving. Good for some, frightening for others. An old woman in the Jewish quarter prays that her family will be safe amidst these changes, while a converted Christian, formerly Muslim, Miller, hopes no one denounces him falsely to the Inquisition. The stars glitter over this land that has seen so much blend of cultures. As midnight approaches, a lone guitar string is plucked somewhere, and a plaintive lullaby, in Ladino, Judeo-Spanish, drifts through an open window, singing of Jerusalem far away, perhaps an omen. Yet for now, the city sleeps under the guard's watch, and the wheels of medieval justice in Spain turn slowly into the modern era. Thus, medieval Iberia's justice can be characterized as pluralistic under multiple laws, gradually unifying under Christian rule, and deeply influenced by the interplay of cultural religious communities. It had advanced legal codes like the Siete Partidas, and unique institutions like the Justicia of Aragon and the Hermandad policing, all contributing to the tapestry. People maneuvered within this system much as elsewhere, seeking out charters that favored them, leveraging sanctuary or community support, sometimes falling victim to harsher turns, like inquisitorial zeal. And as everywhere, being proven lucky could be as important as being proved innocent, whether it meant finding favor with a lenient alcalde or simply not drawing the attention of powerful enforcers. We have now journeyed through many lands and laws. One region remains to explore under the soft glow of the stars, the far north of Europe, Scandinavia, the Viking and medieval Nordic world, where things assemblies gathered under open skies, and where the harsh climate forged a people who valued law, but also independence. Let us sail north, perhaps imagining a dragon-prowed longship cutting across a fjord reflecting the moon, to see how justice was done among the Norsemen and their medieval descendants. In the grey pre-dawn light of a Nordic summer day, a circle of men and women gathers on a broad grassy plain by a fjord. At the centre stands a tall wooden post, the law rock or pillar marking the assembly site. A cool mist clings to the earth, and the sea beyond lies calm. One by one, local farmers and chiefs arrive on horseback or on foot, armed not for war but as a sign of their free status. Soon a hush falls, and an elderly man, the law speaker Lagman, or Lögsögumather as he is called in Old Norse, steps up to the law rock. In a resonant voice, he begins to recite the law. For in this Scandinavian thing, assembly, the laws are not written, but memorized and spoken aloud for all to hear. He might recite 1/3 of all laws at each annual meeting, so that every 3 years the entire corpus of law is publicly spoken, lest anyone forget. This is the scene of a thing, the fundamental legal gathering of medieval Scandinavia, where free men legislate, bear witness, and render judgment collectively. It is at once democratic and traditional, an embodiment of how northern societies balanced community governance with ancient customs. Imagine we are in Iceland around the year 1000 at the Althing, the National Assembly. Iceland's Althing famously began in 930 AD. Thousands have come from across the island each summer to the Great Rift Valley at Thingvellir. Campsites dot the plain, legal cases, disputes, and feasts intermix. At the Law Rock, Lögberg, the law speaker declares decisions of disputes. For instance, this year, 2 rival clans have brought a blood feud to the Althing for arbitration. Rather than let it spiral into endless revenge, the Althing mediates. One side will pay hefty wergild, compensation for the man slain, and both sides swear peace. The Assembly's authority compels them. Failure to accept would mean being declared outlaw and thus stripped of protection. Indeed, outlawry is a dreaded fate in Norse law. A full outlaw skoganger in Icelandic, meaning forest-going, must leave society entirely, or else anyone may kill him without penalty. The Icelandic sagas are rife with tales of outlaws, surviving on the fringes, like Grettir the Strong, an outlaw who lived in the wilds. Lesser outlawry might be temporary. 3 years exile, for example. The fact that the threat of outlawry was enough to usually enforce settlements shows the power of communal law. Being cast out of the community in that harsh environment was tantamount to death, or worse. Scandinavian law, like the Germanic, initially emphasized fines and compensations over mutilation or execution. Early Viking Age law codes, though first written down in the 12th–13th centuries, detail elaborate tariffs. So many marks of silver for a lost finger, more for an arm, etc. This reflects a time when keeping peace between strong warrior families was paramount. Paying compensation prevented blood feuds. However, honor culture was also strong. An insult could provoke a legal duel or feud, if not redressed. The assembly provided a venue to seek redress in words and silver instead of blood. But if that failed, people often took matters into their own hands. As Christianity and centralized kingship came around, 10th and 11th centuries, the law codes began to include more corporal and capital punishments, influenced by European norms and canon law. For example, in 12th century Sweden or Norway, we start seeing decrees against pagan practices, like outlawing of infanticide or certain types of sorcery, and introduction of execution for crimes like theft beyond a second offence. which earlier might have been just fines plus outlawry. But even into the 13th century, Scandinavian penal law remained less brutal in some ways than elsewhere. The idea of penitential or banishment punishments often preferred to say torture, which was generally not a feature of medieval Scandinavian law until later with witch hunts in 17th C. Let's picture a medieval Swedish thing around the mid-14th century. After laws were written, Sweden had provincial law codes. For example, the Law of Uppland, 1296, or the Law of Goethe. A local judge, usually a lagman from the nobility, and a jury of peasants, often 12 good men from the 100, convene. A case. A farmer accuses his neighbour of stealing a cow. According to law, the accuser had to have taken him with hand in tilgrep, basically caught him in the act, or have very solid proof. If not, the accused could clear himself by oath or compurgation. Maybe that's what happens. The neighbour swears an oath of innocence, with 6 oath helpers vouching he's honest. The assembly, hearing no contrary proof, accepts this, and the case is closed. If later the accuser is found to have made a false claim maliciously, he could be fined for defamation. This shows continuity with earlier practice. Oath-taking to establish credibility. Another case at the same thing. A brawl resulted in a man's death. If it was deemed manslaughter, unintentional or semi-intentional in a fight, the law might allow a fine a hefty weregild to the dead's family, and perhaps lesser outlawry. If it was murder, secret killing with malice, by the newer Christian-influenced laws, the murderer should be executed, maybe beheaded, and certainly outlawed if he fled. But suppose the murderer's kin come to the thing offering Bert compensation beyond what the law asks. They plead for mercy to avoid a feud. The dead man's kin, valuing peace, might accept extra weregild and the murderer be instead exiled rather than executed. The assembly would sanction this compromise. This mix of old custom, weregild, and new royal law, capital punishment, often played out. People often preferred to settle for compensation because execution gave no benefit to the victim's family. Yet kings and church pressed for harsher penalties, for deterring violence and enforcing Christian moral order. No vengeance cycles. In Scandinavia, one finds interesting rights for women compared to some other medieval regions. For instance, in Iceland and Norway, women could inherit property, if no sons, though a portion often had to go to nearest male kin after her death, and they could initiate divorce, on grounds like impotence or abuse, according to some early laws. One famous story from Iceland's sagas is about a woman, Unn, the deep-minded, who manages her own fate and wealth, showing that within the law women could have agency, especially widows. Of course, legal theory and practice might differ. Women were still under guardianship, often father or husband. But at least one part of Norway's landslov of 1274 King, Magnus Lagabøte's national law code, explicitly gave daughters rights to inherit a share, though less than sons. This was reflective of Germanic customary principles adjusting under Christian influence to treat all legitimate children somewhat fairly. Similarly, Scandinavian law was regionally varied. For example, Danish law of Jutland 1241 versus Scanian law had differences. But by late 14th C, Denmark also compiled a sort of common law. With the rise of stronger monarchies in late medieval Scandinavia, like the Kalmar Union era, royal and church courts started to overshadow the things. For example, serious crimes might be pulled up to the king's court. Also, the church held church things to try clergy or enforce canon law. But still, at local levels, the thing tradition persisted right into modern times. In fact, ting is still the word for parliament. In Norway and Denmark, thing sites are tourist attractions. Punishments in medieval Scandinavia included fines, most common, outlawry, very serious, often for homicide or repeated theft, and death for certain crimes, like treason. Witchcraft by late period, or if someone refused to honour Wergild and continued a blood feud unabated, the thing might sanction his killing as an outlaw. Notably, some sagas mention trial by ordeal being used in Christian times for things like testing a wife's fidelity. The saga of Gudrun Osvifsdottir has a scene akin to ordeal. Ordeal was used, the church would have facilitated, until 1215 as elsewhere. After that, they too had to shift away. The above-mentioned Norwegian law, referencing ordeal by hot iron for bestiality, shows it was in their provincial law. But with ordeal gone, the Inquisition method, priestly investigation with torture, did not really take root strongly until later witch craze from continental influence. Feuds and honour were a shadow system of justice. If legal avenues failed, or one felt slighted beyond repair, blood feud might erupt. Law codes tried to regulate even that. For example, Icelandic law allowed one to avenge a slain father by killing the killer, but only if done within certain time and openly, not by treachery, kind of legal vengeance. If one followed those rules, it might be tolerated or result in mild punishment because it was seen as carrying out justice that the court may have inadequately done. The sagas are full of such grey zone vengeance. Over time, with more state control, such private retribution became less acceptable. Another unique concept, holmgang, a form of duel practiced in earlier Viking age. By medieval times, 11th c, it was outlawed in Iceland because it was too abused, strong men forcing weak into duels for land. But the idea of single combat to resolve disputes persisted culturally. Even in late medieval Sweden, there are records of judicial duels, some between women too, following German influence of practice, where a man versus woman duel had specific rules if a woman accused a man, or vice versa, but not very common. A note on prisons, hardly existent beyond holding cells. There was something known as the King's Pit, or such, in some castles where dangerous outlaws might be kept if captured alive, but generally small scale. Some sources mention slaves or thralls might be chained as punishment. Slavery in Scandinavia was abolished around 13th c under Christian law, though thralls earlier were part of society. Possibly thralls faced physical punishment at will of master, considered domestic matter historically. By medieval times, being made a thrall as punishment wasn't a thing. Instead, you'd be outlawed or fined. Church influence. After conversion, to 1000 AD, across the region, many laws changed. Adultery or rape, previously, might have been compensated by fine to husband or father of woman. Church morality gradually criminalized these more, though Scandinavians still treated them often as family matters, with fines. The Church also introduced punishments for blasphemy, working on Sundays, etc., usually administered by ecclesiastic courts, penance. The secular laws incorporate some, like banning heathen practices, burying treasures with the dead so people wouldn't do pagan burial rites, eating horse meat, pagan sacrificial food, etc. So law became a tool for Christianization too. Consider a midnight scene in Bergen, Norway, in 1300. The city sleeps, but in the bishop's palace, a candle burns. A priest is writing a letter to Archbishop, complaining that merchants keep trading on holy days, ignoring the new law. Could a royal edict reinforce it? This shows emerging structure, church and state collaborating to impose order even in far corners. Outside, at the wharf, a drunk seaman is caught stealing from a warehouse. The city guard, possibly the Galka or town law officer, locks him up. Next morning, the city bylaw, influenced by Hanseatic trade laws, since many Germans in Bergen, prescribes that he sit in the pillory for half a day and be fined to repay the goods. They handle it swiftly and publicly to warn others. Meanwhile, up in a fjord valley, a local thing meets without much interference. An old way persists with farmers solving disputes, much as their ancestors did. This coexistence of old and new was characteristic. Finally, as dawn breaks on our Scandinavian night, one could imagine the faint strains of a Hardanger fiddle or some instrument being played in a farmhouse. Anachronistic, perhaps, but symbolizing the peaceful rural life that law sought to maintain. The community is close-knit. Everyone knows each other's character. Upstanding folk likely avoid trouble, and if a youth falls into crime, elders often step in to mend it before it goes to a thing. The law here is personal and communal. It carries moral weight more than threat of state power, at least until later centralized kingdoms. Even the kings, like Magnus VI of Norway, writing the Landslov, emphasize fairness and mercy. He earned the nickname Lagabøte, law mender, for improving justice. In that Nordic ethos, the best law was one that everyone found reasonable and clear, reducing strife among neighbours. In summary, medieval Scandinavian justice centred on the thing system, heavy reliance on community consensus, fines and outlawry, and a gradual shift to royal law. It remained somewhat more community-driven and less feudal than in parts of Germany or France. Peasants had a voice in many places, like free farmers of Norway or Iceland. The concept of luck, or divine favour, also appears in their tradition. For example, a man might prove his case by oath if he was of good repute, almost like "God is my witness," or by enduring an ordeal if it was earlier times, trusting God or fate to show truth. Thus, being proven lucky could literally mean surviving an ordeal unscathed, or simply having enough honourable friends to swear on your behalf. The cold, dark winters of the north and the bright, endless summer days both fostered a culture where law was a collective shield against the hardships of nature and human conflict. Now, the horizon begins to glow. Our long night of medieval exploration nears its end. The scenes of justice, from England to Scandinavia, from public trials to secret petitions, from brutal punishments to merciful settlements, have shown us a world at once familiar in its quest for fairness and foreign in its methods. We won't conclude with a grand judgment of that era, as our purpose was not to measure it by modern scales, but to dwell within it, to feel how people lived under, and sometimes despite their laws. The medieval mind saw justice as a balance. Earthly courts mirrored the divine judgment they believed would come in the afterlife. Perhaps that's why so often guilt had to be proven by signs of God's favour, like healed wounds or victorious champions. The phrase we began with, guilty until proven lucky, captures the precariousness many must have felt. An accusation could damn you unless fortune or providence intervened, whether through a sympathetic jury, a powerful patron, a successful ordeal, or a community willing to support your oath. Luck, fate, God's will, call it what you will, it loomed large in an age where empirical evidence was scarce and legal processes rudimentary. Yet, through these stories runs a thread of human resilience and ingenuity. Medieval people were not passive victims of arbitrary justice. They learned to navigate it, to use its tools, like sanctuary, benefit of clergy, compurgation, to their advantage. They formed guilds and communes to band together for better legal status. They appealed to higher authorities when local ones were unjust. And gradually they shaped the evolution of justice, pushing it, inch by inch, towards more consistency and equity. Though many dark turns remained, such as the witch hunts or persecution of minorities. By 1500, as we've seen, many seeds of modern legal systems were planted. Parliaments, written codes, professional judges, the concept of evidence, and the ideal, if not reality yet, of universal rules applied to all. Now, as a gentle sun rises and birds begin to sing over a misty medieval village green, we can let our minds rest. We have wandered long in the past. Perhaps you have drifted to sleep at times, envisioning the quiet halls of a monastery court or the open air of a thing meeting under an oak. That's fine. This tale was meant as much to soothe as to inform. The imagery of a calm, orderly resolution, a judge's gavel, or, in medieval terms, staff, coming down as a dispute ends, hands shaken, a fine paid, a penance assigned, can be comforting. It reminds us that even in an age of violence and plague, people yearned for and worked for order and peace. Feel the weight of those centuries lift now. Our journey through medieval justice, guilty until proven lucky, ends not with a dramatic verdict, but with a slow return to silence. The law roll is rolled up and tied, the court benches empty, the torches extinguished. A town crier in some market square might cry, "Oyez! Oyez! The court is adjourned!" and all go home to their dinners. So too, we adjourn our narrative. The medieval night of law gives way to day, and as we step out of the past, we carry with us a newfound appreciation for the timeless human quest for justice, in all its flawed and hopeful forms. Thank you for coming on this lengthy vigil through the ages. May your sleep be untroubled, and your dreams filled with flickering torchlight and ancient wisdom gently glowing in the dark.